We're going to be talking about the relationship between divine sovereignty and human freedom. As has just been mentioned, this has been a centuries-old debate. It is a debate that many people want to have specific answers to. They want to have clarity on this very important subject. In studio with me today, James White. He's the author of a book called Potter's Freedom, and George Bryson, the author of a brand new book. In fact, I've got the first copies in my hand. It's called The Dark Side of Calvinism. Now, I'm a little bit at a disadvantage, George, in that I have not yet had an opportunity to read your book, but I'm very familiar with your work and glad to have you with us. James, let's start with you. You write, with respect to unconditional election, God elects a specific people unto himself without reference to anything they do. This means the basis of God's choice of the elect is solely within himself, his grace, his mercy, his will. It is not man's actions, works, or even foreseen faith that decrees or draws God's choice. God's election is unconditional and final. Does that mean, in essence, that there are perhaps, arguably, billions of people that are doomed before the womb?
Well, what it means is that God's grace is free, and that grace cannot be demanded by anyone, that it has to come from God's freedom. And that means there are individuals who, because they love their sin and continue in their sin, will experience the justice of God, but that he, for his own purposes, and it's not, as I mentioned in that quote, anything in me, the reason that I embrace Christ and a person across the street does not, is not found because I'm smarter, more spiritual, that I'm better in any way that they are. Instead, just as Paul says in Romans chapter 9, before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, so that God's calling and election might stand for certain, one was chosen and one was not. And so really the issue is God demonstrates his love, mercy, and grace with the elect, and he demonstrates his justice. And that's something that I hope comes up a good bit today, because it's not something we hear much in evangelical church today, but God makes it a priority to demonstrate his justice, and he does so with Pharaoh, with Pharaoh's army. I mean, we could go through history and come up with many, many examples where he has justly brought his wrath upon those individuals who loved their sin, reveled in their sin, despite the fact they were surrounded by God's creation, continued to suppress that knowledge, as Paul says in Romans chapter 1, and as such, he demonstrates his justice before in his judgment of them. Now, when you say before the womb, I think it's important to point out that we were in Adam before the womb. This is part and parcel of what's called federal theology, the fact that we fell in Adam. And so when we talk about before the womb, we need to be careful we differentiate between our experience of time and God's eternality. Yes, before the womb, God obviously, not only for the elect, says that they are already seated in the heavenly places, Ephesians chapter 2, but we experience salvation in time. In the same way an individual prior to their birth, does God know everything they're going to do? I would argue that he does, and in fact, hopefully we'll discuss upon what basis he knows what they're going to do. What is the basis of God's exhaustive knowledge of the future? Because everyone involved in this debate believes God has exhaustive knowledge of the future. How does God know that? And how is that related to his justice?
But there will be then, in your view, billions of people that never have an opportunity to respond to the gospel. They are incapable, unable to respond to the gospel. Is that the position?
The position is that they do not desire God. They do not have any desire to respond to any message whatsoever.
So they could respond, but they just do not desire to respond.
They themselves, because what did Jesus said?
So the point is they can't respond.
They cannot respond because of their own sin. He who commits sin is the slave of sin. Jesus himself said, when the people were offended, when Jesus said, if you continue my word, then you're my disciples, you know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. They said, we are free. That concept of freedom is part and parcel of what I believe the Bible is denying. When Jesus says, no one is able to come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up the last day. The Bible emphasizes God's ability and man's inability because of his sin and his fallen, corrupt nature.
So do you agree with what John Calvin wrote when he said, all are not created on equal terms? But some are preordained to eternal life, others to eternal damnation, and accordingly, as each has been created for one or another of those ends, we say that he has been predestined to life or death.
Yes.
You agree with that point
Yes.
of view. And now you have people who, like R.C. Sproul, and George, let me direct this to you, would say that it's one thing to say that God elects some for salvation. It is quite another to say that he elects some for reprobation. In fact, in your book, and I had an opportunity to read this quote, and you'll have to provide the source, but evidently what R.C. Sproul would say to what James White has just agreed to on the basis of Calvin's quote, that this is hyper-Calvinism with unorthodox, anti, or even sub-Calvinism perspective in mind.
Well, I don't want to speak for James because he does a great job for himself, but I would say R.C. Sproul really believes exactly what James White believes and what most mainstream Calvinists believe. What he's trying to accomplish, I think, is impossible. He's trying to say, on one hand, that God can elect people to salvation without electing them to damnation. Calvin himself said that that's the result of being a washy moderator or a very bad interpreter. Calvin said you can't have one without the other if you understand unconditional election.
Okay, but what I'm trying to get at here real quickly is Sproul claims, I'm reading from your book, page 34, Sproul claims, you say, that only a hyper-Calvinist could say such a thing. He equates hyper-Calvinism with unorthodox, anti, or even sub-Calvinism. In other words, it's one thing to say that God elects for salvation. However, to add the other part to the equation, that he also elects to reprobation, is, in fact, it seems in context, that's what you're saying Sproul is saying. That is hyper-Calvinism, as opposed to hypo-Calvinism.
Yeah, what he gives you on one hand, he takes away with the other. The truth is, again, I've been reading Sproul for years, not James White as long, but I cannot tell the difference between the position that Sproul takes. I think James White is just a little more willing to lay it out on the table. Sproul believes exactly the same thing. Calvin took an even harder position.
But what's this quote? I don't understand this quote in your book.
He's on one hand trying to deny what he also affirms. That's the problem with Calvinism, is people want to back off from what they have committed themselves to. Once you commit yourself to the doctrine of unconditional election, everything else falls into place. Now, there is something called hyper-Calvinism. R.C. Sproul is not a hyper-Calvinist, nor is James White.
That's correct.
James White is not a hyper-Calvinist. What James White is referring to here is mainstream Calvinism.